My name is Dalton Dupuy,
And do you appear on behalf of anyone?
and I'm appearing on behalf of CAFA.
Sorry,
who's been
for
a-
those of us who don't know what CAFA is.
And for those that don't know what CAFA is, it's Central Australian Frack Free Alliance.
Thank you very much.
I'm a retired businessman and a forensic volunteer ecologist. I'm presenting on behalf of CAFA. CAFA is opposed to fracking in the Northern Territory, but in good faith has presented and is presenting our views on the draft report. Let me say first that all wells will fail from the time of installation to a period 1,000 years or 10,000 years from now. In your report on page 9, well integrity, you refer to it and the lack of available information, and that becomes informative because we don't really know, and neither do you.
Page 9 of which report?
In
Not
the
the
summary?
draft final,
In the
only the
summary?
summary?
Yep,
Have you read the actual draft final?
I have.
Okay, good. No, just for the record again, it's just going to be easier if you just make sure which book you're referring to.
Which you're referring to.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. CAFA believes that all legislation and regulations need to be in place before any further exploration and operational license are issued. That sort of goes a long line with your summary conclusion on page 50 in your summary. I grew up in the southwestern United States, and I've been around miners and gas and oil companies all my life. Miners have not been what I consider exemplary citizens, and it's regulations and legislation that has forced them to take responsibility for their speculative activities, and I would encourage that the government take action on the basis of your recommendations in that regard. My second point is that it's essential that all baseline studies are conducted before any further exploration occurs. Otherwise, data validity becomes seriously contaminated. And I mean, even medical practitioners do physical examinations on healthy people so that they've got a baseline. And it's no different for this environment. My third point is that I believe the inquiry has been diligent and mostly perspicacious. And on that point, I'd like to say all of the recommendations, and hopefully with our amendments, need to be adopted. And that basically means no exception. When I read through the recommendations that you have written, with few exceptions, CAFA agreed or asked that you strengthen the statement. So instead of where you've written production licenses, that you put it for exploration licenses. And there's a number of those recommendations that's been identified from. And for instance, recommendation 7.1, 7.4, and there's a number of them that go through there that you've identified that. It's just about taking care before we start to inject the landscape with chemicals and processes that we may not appreciate in the fullest of time. Heather's already raised the issue with water. In Central Australia, we have a very limited choice of water, and it must be protected at all costs. Where there is uncertainty of groundwater safety, or in fact any uncertainty of environmental safety, then the moratorium on hydraulic fracturing must remain in place. We need to get it right. We need to get it right and safe the first time and every time. I would not put my children or grandchildren on an uncertain or unfinished aircraft, metaphorically, and that's just a metaphor for how I see this circumstance. In November, I went to see my children who live scattered on the eastern side and had occasion to visit an old friend in near Roma, Queensland. And his 20,000 acre place is in the middle of country that's got coal seam gas being mined. While I was there, I had occasion to visit, more than two, but at least two people that spoke about it, and their stories were informative. The first one was a fairly senior man with a very large place, and I asked he and his wife, I said, because he'd indicated that they were going to make an agreement with Origin to conduct fracking on that property. And I said, could you oppose it? And he said, well, I could, but he said they'll just go to a neighbor and drill horizontally from their vertical bores and go underneath my place and do it anyway. So I need to get out of them what I can. And that's a fairly cynical sort of attitude, but it's exemplary of what a number of people in that community felt. The other one's probably a bit more disturbing. And to a cowboy that grew up in West Texas, which I have, I sort of got his energy. And he said to an Origin foreman who was coming onto his place to start the work, he said, when you're coming? And he said, tomorrow. I says, well, make sure you bring a front end loader. And the foreman said, well, we won't need a front end loader at this stage. And he said, well, look, just make sure you bring a front end loader. And the third time he said it, the foreman finally asked her, he says to the landowner, he says, why do you ask me to bring a front end loader? He says, because as soon as you cross the boundary, I'm going to shoot you and I'll need the front end loader to bury you. And that's clearly an expression of anger and resentment about gas companies and how they feel like they've been treated. Landowners are in a unique circumstance. Often they're probably the canary in the coal mine, if you wish. We there support the recommendation that landowners must be in full informed agreement before any exploration or operations can occur. And we suggest even that they may have the right of veto, and probably for quite good reasons. They do have responsibility for biosecurity, and responsibilities of that from my time in the Roma, Injune, Taroom district. I observed widespread stands of African lovegrass, numerous incidences of parthenium along the roads, and pipelines used by the gas vehicles and their inspection vehicles. Sure, they weren't the only ones on the roads, but they were often the most frequent user of the road. And as a result of that, there needs to be in place pest controls. Even some of the invertebrates must be considered, whether it's a fire ant or some of the others. There's no environmental impact statements done in Australia that include invertebrates. And sadly, that's an unfortunate circumstance because that means bees, ants, dung beetles, and a whole number of important contributors to this environment are excluded. I went to university on the East Coast and had occasion to visit New York City and different parts of that environment. And a story came to me about a young fellow that was standing on the footpath, and he was being harassed and pushed and shoved and punched by a group of other boys around him. And he held his ground and didn't move. Afterwards, they gave up. And the old guy next door said, he came to him, he said, why didn't you go inside or run away? He said, he lifted his foot, and he said, because my foot was on the dime. And I would encourage you to pay attention to whose foot is on the dime throughout this inquiry, which I suspect that you already have. The social license to operate by mining companies has probably been negated by three specific phenomena. Their extensive access. I'm just going to take a drink of water, pardon me.
No, please do so.
The extensive access by vested interest to government, chief minister, minister for development, compared to the limited access by deeply concerned activist groups, is an indication of undue influence and probably not a level playing field, which you advocate inside your report. The gas industry has conducted no surveys of community, and views that have been compared to CAFA, which at the very least has conducted a survey of Alice Springs in 2016 and came up with a pretty definitive answer after talking to 500 different households. And finally, if industry, in terms of this social license to operate, if industry pushes back on your recommendations, they are distrusting this inquiry and its interviews of hundreds of different Territorians. And if they disagree with the evidence that you've collected, once again, their social license is certainly diminished and may be negated. Unconventional gas mining potentially affects all of us in regards to water, amenity, and community. And therefore, I think each of us has a say and needs to have a say at some level. I won't say in what form. I'm stating, I suppose my seventh point, it's stating the obvious, which is economic benefit must be second to environmental safety. And that's a challenge for lots of people from business and commercial interests. But we support the option for the regulator in that the environment minister has the final say on a project proceeding or not. And that's my primary points. I come with a couple of posers in a way. And the first one is about the assessment that you commissioned by Asal Allen. And unfortunately, there was no economic analysis of what it's like to be frack free. And the calm scenario wasn't included in terms of what's the economic benefit to the Northern Territory to have a few exploration wells and realize that it's uneconomic. Moving societies from toxic addiction, i.e. fossil fuels, to a healthy addiction, say renewables, seems to be a positive opportunity that we could actually take advantage of. And I would say that, I know it's not part of the terms of reference in this inquiry, but in terms of big picture, having a gas industry comparing to another industry that may be less damaging to the environment seems to be a possibility. I suppose before I start my final point, I'm about to point the finger, and I know that as soon as I point the finger, there's three pointing back at me. And the recent story about the well being drilled near Daly Waters on the Mungie Station, and I found it ironic that you've got a fairly strong statement about protection of whistleblowers in your recommendations, and 14.25 if you like. And yet you treated the whistleblower, it seemed to me that you treated the whistleblower about Origin not pointing out the misinformation provided as though they had done as though the whistleblower had actually done something wrong. And I'd ask you to consider your position in that regard. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Just from me, at least, a couple of points of clarification. Firstly, Asal Allen have indeed modeled the no fracking scenario. That is, the ban stays in place.
Yep.
They have modeled that.
Did they do the economic assessment of what it would be like for the territory without fracking?
Yes.
Okay.
They did.
I missed it.
That's all right. I just wanted to point that out. As for your comment about the whistleblower, I don't know whether you've had a chance to look at that live stream and consider the events that occurred, but it became apparent that in fact the characterization of what Origin had done was in fact just plain wrong.
Okay.
And that in fact that diagram, far from there being a cover-up, had been in the public domain since the 25th of May last year.
Okay.
And that was on the website in two submissions, no less, for all the world to see.
Okay.
So with great respect, no, I do need to correct this. With great respect, there was no attempt to judge to use your words, whistleblower. The whistleblower, again, to use your words, just simply got it wrong.
Okay. Yep. I can accept that. My information came from ABC Newsfeed, so I've not been able to live stream where I live.
That was subsequently updated.
Okay.
So I would urge you, if you want to find out exactly what occurred, I
Great.
would urge you to go. The live stream feed is up on our website.
Okay.
But there was a subsequent clarification or explanation by Origin. There was a clarification by the panel as to the I guess timeline.
Yep.
Which explains how the two different versions of the diagrams came about in our reports. There was then a clarification by Dr. David Close of Origin. And then there was a clarification by Ms. Naomi Hogan. There was no apology. That's a matter for her. But it's apparent that simply the characterization was just simply wrong.
That's why I said the thing about one finger pointing forward and three pointing back. Thank you.
Well, it's.
So I'm wrong. I was wrong too.
The allegations that were made against Origin of having engaged in some type of deliberate cover-up, they were very serious allegations.
Yep.
They were wrong. They've been proven to be wrong. And it's. I think the panel expressed at the time that the panel was satisfied with the explanation that's been provided by Origin and our own research in our own timeline to explain what has occurred. It's a matter, I must say, it's a matter of continuing concern to the panel that those allegations made by Ms. Hogan have not been fully and properly withdrawn and an apology issued.
Right. I would say that I'm not a member of Lock the Gate, and I take that point. And I've not made I've not made a mistake before.
And no one
And
said
I appreciate you give the feedback for that, because that makes it easier for me to work with.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Professor Priestley.
Thank you, Mr. Dupuy. I'm just wondering if I've heard you correctly or interpreted correctly. You indicated that you grew up in southwestern USA, and you made the comment that you thought that the impacts of regulation on the industry, were they positive? I wasn't quite clear whether you thought that these are positive impacts.
Well, regulation, I mean, I think I'm going to have to move from being a spokesperson for CAFA to speaking for myself in that regard. My experience in the past with mining companies is that and gas and oil companies, having been surrounded by them, was they would only do what they were forced to do in terms of social contribution, in terms of workers. Unions forced them, legislation by governments forced them. As the environmental impacts of what miners do became obvious, then they were forced to adhere to things. And that's happened in Queensland, as we all know, that as time's gone on, the regulations have increased and the oil and gas companies have been forced to comply, well, as much as they're willing to. So part of it's probably my younger life of being aware of how they weren't such great citizens in terms of rehabilitation, and driving across from here through the Central Desert to Kalgoorlie, it's really quite evident about how much the miners have left undone.
Yes, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question about the issue of the extent to which the recommendation should be applying before exploration as opposed to before
Sure.
production. And it's a really important issue. It's been brought up by a number of people, and it's something that the panel is still considering very deeply. One of the issues is that if they were applied before expiration, it would mean that the gas industry would be required to do things that other industries, including existing industries, are not required to do for doing exactly the same thing. And so there would be a case of different industries facing different requirements for doing exactly the same thing. And I'm just wondering about, your thoughts on how appropriate that would be.
It's an economic decision, and it's probably a political football. But I would say that it's not dissimilar to the changes that were legislated to the building of vehicles in Australia in the 70s, that every car had to have a seatbelt. And there were cars being made that didn't have seatbelts. And so how did the extra work being put into having to install seatbelts raise the price of the vehicle compared to those that were grandfathered out? And I think probably if we were in a different environment where it wasn't a single shot, that you might do it that way. But if we're going to put a spacecraft up into a vacuum, things have to be right. If there's only one water supply for Central Australia, if it's not safe, it can't go. And that means err on the side of caution, if you wish. And that would be CAFA's, I'm sure that's CAFA's point of view. CAFA's pretty clear that they do not want fracking, and as has been declared in a number of jurisdictions. And they're only contributing as best we can in the context of this inquiry.
We'll work down. Dr. Jones.
Thanks for your insightful comments that you made. And I was looking at the record I copied down about your comments about social licence to operate. I noticed particularly your third point about if the government was to cherry pick recommendations and so on, that your view is that it would further diminish the social licence of the industry to operate because it hasn't taken the whole package.
Yep, that's my view. And that would be CAFA's view that, look, you guys have done the work, and to disavow even a part of it is disavowing a part of what you've done. And I mean, I'm quite happy, as you've already seen, willing to challenge the panel and raise an issue. But if a gas company started to push back already on weed control officers, which I have heard anecdotally, then why? Because there's a really quite strong argument for weed control officers having a dedicated position and gas company having to fund them. And it's probably more challenging in a sense in terms of if you consider the invertebrates like fire ants. And I mean, I've seen the damage that Parthenium can do and that African lovegrass can do, and it's not a pretty sight. So, I mean, I would say that your recommendations are based on a fairly perspicacious and diligent process, and therefore it needs to be accepted. And traditionally, recommendations by panels such as yourself has not been necessarily accepted holus bolus by industry. And that's my experience in another life, in another world.
Yes, I think Professor Hart had a question.
Yes, a question on your concern about potential contamination of groundwaters, particularly around Alice. Reasonable concern. I just wondered, though, what was your view about Mereenie, which is pretty close, and it's been going for, 30, 40 years.
Mereenie's a conventional gas field, and they have used, or has used conventional mining techniques there. My view about that is that it would be fantastic, and I've advocated it already, that the Mereenie gas field be examined for fugitive emissions, and that the pipeline from Mereenie to Darwin be examined for the same thing, for its pipeline integrity and for the well's integrity in that Mereenie basin. And to me, that would inform at least a couple of things. It would inform the panel in terms of how much the gas companies are willing to put their money where their mouth is and do that inspection. And they probably do some, but I would like it to be a fairly diligent and involved process so that there was so we could actually trust the results.
So there is no monitoring of methane in that system?
To be honest, I don't know.
Right.
I suspect there could be some, but I think that the monitors that are available are fairly light on the ground at the moment, and funding a regulator or a monitor for each wellhead, which is probably what I would suspect would be required, at least in the initial circumstance, is a fairly costly exercise and potentially exploitive. So in terms of, it's easy to buy off somebody that's not well paid and to get a result that you want. So, I mean, I would want the regulator to be pretty diligent and pretty well funded so that they could actually do the job properly.
Yep. Just the last point, on your suggestion that our recommendations in total be accepted, that's been our point, that's been our viewpoint.
Yep.
All the way, and I can't see that we would change this. Nothing being put up that suggests that we should.
So I'm sorry I'm not clear what you're asking a
I'm
question?
saying that we've made it clear
Yeah, okay.
that our recommendations in total
Yep.
relate to that final conclusion. Yep.
And just to that point, because CAFA is actually supporting that position, recognize that their social license to operate is significant.
Sure.
Because we've actually realized what the work you've done, even though we've actually opposed to fracking, that there is a level of support for that, for this to be accepted whole as bolus.
Just wanted to follow up on something that you said to Professor Hart. I think you said that Marini used conventional techniques. That Marini used conventional techniques. Would it come then for as a surprise to you to find out that, in fact, about a third of the wells at Marini have been fracked at some stage?
And do you mean horizontally, that they've drilled down vertically and then...
Drilled down vertically,
and then-
not horizontally, but
not
they've drilled down vertically,
vertically.
and they fracked.
And they fracked,
They've
that's right.
watered down,
I
they put
understand that.
chemicals and so on.
Yep, I understand that. And
Does that change your view at all of that field?
not unless I saw the results of what's happening out there at the moment.
So is your complaint then really about fracking then more about the fact it goes horizontal
I'm
underground?
talking about, well,
Or
fracking
is it
usually
the
is
chemicals?
implied with unconventional mining techniques, which is about a vertical well followed by a horizontal, if you like, spider web that goes out from it. And that's at a really serious depth. And monitoring and quality control on those issues are significant. And the fact that Marini's been fracked in vertical holes it's sad that they've felt that they had to do that, but and maybe the horse is bolted.
Sorry, maybe.
The horse is bolted before the barn doors closed. In other words, maybe the damage has been done, and until that was assessed, I couldn't actually say something more except that we're opposed to fracking, full stop.
Okay, again, perhaps I've misunderstood. I just want to get your opposition to what is it about fracking that you
Risk of
don't-
contamination to the water.
Okay, but then surely that risk still exists by a vertical drill and frack.
It does indeed. But that's why I would say that there needs to be an examination of what goes on out there in a pretty deep way.
And certainly, again, to reiterate what Professor Hart, my deputy, said, that, and if it's not clear, we will make it much clearer in the Bono report that we will be putting to government, that this is a whole package.
Yep.
And that our overall conclusions as to the mitigated risk profile of this industry are based on implementation of the whole package.
Yep. Thanks, Justice.
Any further comments or questions? Yes, Dr. Beck.
Just following up on that point, I think you made the observation during your presentations that you supported all recommendations, but you had a caveat that I think it was that with the suggested CAFA amendments be adopted, and hence the package applied in full.
And what I meant by that is that the recommendations that you've written, all we've actually done is suggested that you strengthen those that aren't. So where it says license to operate becomes for exploration, for instance,
Yes.
So there's a few of those sort of things, and that's the level that we're talking about.
Right. And if all of that was done in an ideal world, what's CAFA's position?
They would probably be unhappy with it and continue to lobby, but nevertheless, a level of acceptance that the best was being done in the current circumstance.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you very much for presenting today, Mr. Dupuy.
Thanks,
Very
Justice.
much appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you.
And good luck to your deliberations, and the environment takes precedence over the economics. Thanks.
Thank you.